When you think about thriving students at St. Augustine's or Fort Valley State or Voorhees University, or you think about the groundbreaking reparations project being undertaken right now by the Virginia Theological Seminary, you might think about the history of African American education in the colonial Anglican Church. And that's because they're all connected with that history. So we'll explore that history a bit, largely based on a 2004 book I wrote about the history of my Episcopal church in Nashville. So to explore African American education in the colonial Anglican Church, we'll explore the beginning of the Church of England's formal education of African Americans in the U.S. colonies, the development of early African American Episcopal education, and finally, resultant growth of African American Episcopal higher education. So the beginning of the Church of England's formal education of African Americans in the U.S. colonies is the first Virginia charter. King James made it clear that one of the responsibilities of the colonists was, quote, propagating of Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and may in time bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to humane civility and to a settled and quiet government. Of course, initially, the people to whom he was referring were the settlers, their indentured servants, the Native Americans. And then, of course, by 1619, we had 20 odd additional people, two of whom were Anthony and Isabel. And their son, William Tucker, was the first person baptized in the Anglican faith in the colonies. Of course, that also makes him the first Black person baptized in the Anglican faith in the colonies. After that early 1620s baptism, many other African Americans also were baptized in the Anglican Church. So for about 40 or 50 years, that was going on. And slave owners were concerned that there might be some thinking that being baptized into the Christian faith meant you were excluded from slavery under the secular law. Therefore, in 1667, Virginia passed a very clear law stating that the conferring of baptism does not alter the condition of person as to his bondage or freedom. You can see the act here. And for many people, the fact of that act, that slave owners were indeed concerned about Christianizing their enslaved people, makes slavery and Christianity very closely connected in many people's minds. The fact that it was indeed the Episcopal or the Anglican Church that was the first to baptize a person of African descent also cements a relationship in many people's minds between the church and slavery. But others express concern, including scholars such as Marcus Jernigan, that that religion really was a subject that occupied the thought and effort of private individuals, all people. And so it was a concern, or not necessarily a good thing, that most of these slaves lived and died strangers to Christianity. The act did indeed, though, have the effect of mitigating some of those concerns. We see here from William Hennig that, quote, diverse masters freed from this doubt may more carefully endeavor the propagation of Christianity by permitting children, though slaves, or those of greater growth, if capable, to be admitted to that sacrament. And that tradition of baptism continued, and many descendants, including these pictured here of Anthony and Isabel and of William Tucker, take delight in their ancestors' Anglican Church membership. So that early practice of baptizing African Americans into the Anglican Church led to the development of early African American Episcopal education. So next, we'll take a look at that development. There were several major organizations primarily responsible for this development. You'd see them listed here. The first two were general organizations for the whole of the population. The last one, the Bray Associates, was specifically to Christianize and educate African Americans, both enslaved and free. That organization had the privilege of the wise counsel of Benjamin Franklin, and in addition to becoming a member, he recommended some of the cities that would be good locations for schools for African Americans. Again, both enslaved and free people, for the purpose of general education and Christian education. And of course, as a Philadelphia man, one of the places, the first place he recommended was Philadelphia. He also recommended several others we'll take a look at. South Carolina was one which opened a school in 1695, and scholar Stiles Lines reports that it's surely significant that more than one half of the Episcopalians in South Carolina just prior to the Civil War were Negroes, mostly slaves. In the whole South, about 1/5 of Episcopal communicants were slaves, and a considerably larger portion of those who were baptized or otherwise under the influence of the church were indeed enslaved. Another well-known teacher of African Americans in the colonial Anglican Church is Elias Neau. He did his teaching in New York. His story is particularly interesting because he actually was enslaved himself, put on a chain gang in 1692. And Raymond Albright, perhaps the most prolific scholar of the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States, says that so highly had Neau's instruction been appreciated that at his death, swarms of Negroes came to William Huddleston, who had been catechizing slaves and apprentices on Sunday afternoons, asking him to continue Neau's work with them. Similar work was actually continued in New York and on a smaller scale in most of the towns in the colony, with good success throughout the 18th century. Samuel Alkmady, an assistant at Trinity Church, reported in 1764 that not one Black that has been admitted by me to Holy Communion has turned out bad or been in any shape a disgrace to our holy profession. Albright goes on to say that when the city of New York came under a jurisdiction, an act similar to that of Virginia, most of the Church of New England missionaries among Black people reported attendance decreasing. That is, reported attendance growing. And Neau in particular reported that it grew to an average of 100 attendants from an average of 30. And he quotes, Neau largely worked with Black people who were slaves and said that even with the protection of the Act of 1706, many slave owners refused to permit their slaves to receive religion. Some of those owners kept their slaves from attending religious services by threatening to sell them into more repressive Virginia if they attended. A slave uprising in New York in 1712 put a damper on Neau's work, as reinvigorated owner fears dictated that few slaves then were permitted to partake in church activities. But by 1719, Black participants in the Anglican Communion was flourishing again, with Neau seeing many free Black people also come to services and instructional classes. Another of those well-renowned teachers of African Americans in the Anglican Church in the colonies was Thomas Bacon in Maryland. His story is particularly interesting because he was an enslaver himself. Interestingly, also, he actually won a lawsuit, a libel lawsuit against a woman he enslaved who had claimed he fathered her child. That was found not to be the case, and after the court so ruled, he sued her for libel and prevailed. And his schools flourished in Maryland. And then there was Thomas Bray, who taught throughout the colonies. And even after his death, the people known as the Bray Associates continued that teaching, including in Williamsburg. Again, the great Episcopal Church historian Albright says that the Associates applied the funds to the instruction of Negro children. The report of the Bray Associates for 1795 included a full page diagram describing such a school in Halifax, Virginia, in which 41 children from 5 to 16 years of age were under the instruction of Deborah Clark for 6 months. Listed are the names of the children and their parents, their age, the books they were using, and the crafts, sewing, knitting, etc. they pursued. Also, in the Williamsburg Bray School, there was a teacher by the name of Ann Wager. What did I just read? Halifax was Deborah. Okay. So in addition to Halifax, in Williamsburg itself, the school was taught by Ann Wager, and between 1760 and 1774, about 400 free and enslaved scholars were educated there. Just recently, the building for that school was discovered on the campus of William and Mary, and archivists assert that it is the oldest surviving building for educating African Americans. So far, $5 million has been devoted to a project to move that extant structure from William and Mary to colonial Williamsburg, where it will be used as part of the living history exhibit so that people can reenact the teachers, the student scholars, the whole environment of African-American education in the Anglican Church in the colonial USA. And this is Dr. Maureen Egglesman Lee, who is leading that project. So when independence came in 1776, the Anglican Church as the Church of England no longer was the church for these new citizens. So they created the Episcopal Church, which is the U.S. offshoot of that. You can see in the image here in the top left, the flag for the Anglican Church, and then in the top right, the flag for the Episcopal Church. And you see it just has the addition of the blue panel. And often the Episcopal Church symbol is indicated in a shield shape, which you can see across the bottom. So the first one is the Episcopal Church. And then beyond the USA, there's the Anglican Church in America, and then the Anglican Church worldwide, which currently has about 86 million communicants. And you can see here how after the Episcopal Church was created, those who were Anglicans in the areas you see of concentration there expanded in these other areas that you see in blue, and African Americans not only continued to expand their numbers in the Episcopal faith, but also newly created or newly expanding faiths of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, and the Baptists. And you can see on this National Geographic map where the other denominations primarily were located. Of course, at this time in the new United States, the major denominations were the Episcopalians, the Congregationalists, and the Methodists, and the Presbyterians, that is. So the primary differences among them are that the Episcopal Church, as the name Episcopal implies or asserts, is run by bishops. And Congregationalist churches are run not by a bishop on high, but at the congregational level. And then the Presbyterians' leadership comes from presbyteries, which are combinations of laymen and clergy people. So with those major structural differences, there are indeed some differences at the theological level. Most people aren't tuned into those differences, though. And what you see on the ground is primarily the same. Within the Episcopal Church, the Bible is key. We also have the Book of Common Prayer, which rearranges some biblical passages in an order that makes sense for praying in a particular way, including praying for leaders. Again, it's a church that recognizes and values authority. And among its creeds is the Nicene Creed, which makes it clear that we believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all that is seen and unseen. 32 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence were members of the Episcopal Church, as have been more U.S. presidents than any other denomination, with 11 of the 46 so far being of the Episcopal faith. So as the Episcopal faith spread among Americans in general, it was also significantly spreading among African Americans